Good morning, YouTube. I know it's been a little while since I've made a video, but today we're doing a long-awaited video. I've gotten a ton of requests to do this. So this is going to be the Racer X front lower control arm install. Now it's going to be slightly different for the 2015 and up WRX and STI. It's going to be extremely similar to the 2008 to 2014. There's only one difference. There's a little spacer here that we use that you guys will not use. And you can probably use a lot of these concepts for the 86 FRS BRZ chassis, but it's going to be slightly different because the arm is actually mounted the other way on those chassis. And then the ball joint is actually built into the lower control arm and then goes up into the knuckle. So these arms will be compatible for 2008 and up WRX and STI. All you would need to do is have the spacer for the 15 and up. And then for the 86s, they will not be compatible. So the primary reason you would get front lower control arms for your car is if you are planning on pushing some big camber and you want to prevent the axle bind. So if you want to retain the all-wheel drive, prevent axle bind. When you're static, you usually bind around -8 degrees of camber. That's where axle bind starts to occur. I know the bags guys can push it a little bit further. I've seen bag guys run up to like -10, -12 with no axle bind issues. But in order to alleviate axle bind issues, this is what's gonna do that for you is gonna be the front lower control arms and then extension of the camber joints in order to satisfy the axle geometry and prevent the bind. Alright, so before we start, we want to make sure we have everything for the front lowers and then we have all the tools that we need before we start, because I get a ton of questions. People are in the middle of their install and they're like, oh, how do I do this? And then I'm like, oh, well, you need to go freaking pick up this fitment puller, and then they never knew that, so then they're stuck and they don't know what to do next. So if you're buying these lower control arms used, you want to make sure that all the bushing ends are in the heim joints. So you have a long bushing, short bushing, and then same for the rear caster, you got long and short. Then you want to make sure you have this hardware. If you have a 1518, you'll have this spacer that's going to go above the caster joint, and then you have this little thick washer that goes below the ball joint before you put the castle nut on, so that you can have that castle nut line up with the hole and you'll be able to insert the cotter pin. We are going to be taking this stock cotter pin out. Damn, what the hell? Marcus did a freaking shitty job putting that in. But you are not supposed to reuse the cotter pins, so go to Home Depot and get some new cotter pins to use. It'll look something like this. I do not believe Racer X includes new cotter pins, but these things are super cheap and super easy to find, so don't be lazy and helpless and just go pick up a bunch from the hardware store, because you never know when you'll need some more. Alright, so here's a quick overview of the tools we'll need. I like to have a 17 mil wrench, 17 and 19 mil sockets. I have an impact gun. If you have an impact, it'll make your life a lot easier. If not, you're gonna have fun breaking all these bolts loose. This is the pitman puller. Now, I don't know the exact dimension that's required for the claw opening. This one is actually a little bit too big. I can only fit one end of the claw in, but even with only one side of the claw, I'm able to pop the ball joint cone off, so I'll show you guys that later in the video. I have inch drive ratchet, got some crescent wrenches, so these will be to manipulate the jam nuts and the turnbuckle for the adjustment rods. And then of course you got your cotter pin, super thick ball joint washer, and the spacer if you are working on a 2015 and up. One last thing before we actually start working on the car. So these may look like they're symmetrical from passenger and driver side, but they are actually side specific. The only way you're going to be able to tell is by looking at this ball joint hole. So this hole is actually a slight cone shape, so one side is bigger than the other. See if we can see it. So this is the bigger side. The bigger side is supposed to be up, and then if we look at the bottom, we can tell it's slightly smaller. I don't know if you can actually tell on camera, but in person you can. So the large opening of the cone hole is going to be up. So make sure you do not install that upside down. Otherwise, there's still a little conical shape to the ball joint stud, even after you pop off the main cone. And that will not be able to fit into the lower control arm if you install them backwards on the wrong side. Alright, so you'll want to zero out the adjustment studs. I put this one 8 turns out on the turnbuckle, so I actually take a Sharpie and I mark a reference point right there so that I can count my turnbuckle turns. There isn't a specific amount to do. It's kind of trial and error, but this ones are 8, so you'll kind of want to do that. If you don't extend it far enough, then your axles are still going to bind. But if you extend it too far, your axles will pop out, so you'll have to find a happy middle. And then we can go ahead and start taking apart the stock lower. So you'll want to take out this cotter pin. The castle nut is a 19 mil. You have this subframe bracing here. You got two 17s holding that in. Then you have the main lower control arm bolts. These are all 19s. And the front subframe bolt, which is a 17 mil with a 17 mil nut. So once you take all that out, it's pretty easy to get the stock front lower control arm out. Oh, you also have to take out the tie rod end link. Or sorry, not the tie rod, the sway bar end link, which I have already done, but you guys will have to do that. That's 17 for the OEM one. Alright, so there is the OEM lower control arm that is out now. We got the bracket right there for the rear bushing out. Now, your guys' ball joint will probably look a little bit different than this. This is a white line replacement ball joint since this ball joint has been replaced before. But basically our next step is going to be taking off this cone. Alright, turn down the flash so it's a little bit easier to see. So we're going to be taking off this cone in order to allow this stud to seat into the new lower control arm. And we will no longer be using this cone. This cone is only going to be used for the OEM front lower control arm. The cone fits into this large opening over there for the OEM one. So one of the things you can actually do is if you need new ball joints or your current ball joints are in poor shape, you can actually buy some new ball joints and replace them. The new ones will actually not come with this cone. This cone is sold separately as a separate part number. So with the new ball joints, you actually won't even have to worry about popping off the cone. But replacing ball joints is also another headache in and of itself. So if you want to just use the current ones, if they're in good enough condition, you can just pop off the cone and reuse the same ball joints you have already. So this is how you would use the fitment puller if the opening is too large to get both claw ends on the cone. Now this is the stud that we crank on against the bottom of the stud, and then we have one claw end on the cone, and as we tighten this up with either a ratchet or an impact gun, it'll pop this cone off. And Marcus actually got a video of me doing it the other day, so I'll put that clip in the video and then you guys will be able to see it.
Ooh, fancy. You can add commentary if you want.
There you go.
What did you just do? I don't know what you just did.
Alright, now that we got that cone off the ball joint, we can go ahead and start installing the new front lower control arm. So the key is to have this rod kind of already adjusted to the point where you want it to before you put it on here. If you put this on the car and then try and adjust this rod with both of these connected, it's very difficult to kind of adjust this while it's on the car. It's very easy for these rods to bind because these rods are super long. So when you're adjusting it, you kind of have to lengthen one, shorten one, lengthen the other. It gets kind of complicated, so that's why it's super easy to bind these up. So you'll kind of want to have the camber one set already. I like to put this one in first, then adjust this until it lines up properly, and then once you get it to that point, you're kind of good and you don't have to mess with it anymore. So I did 8 turns. I would say like 5 to 8 turns is probably a good number to put this turnbuckle out, and then this will just be adjusted in situ when you go to attach this to the mounting point, and I'll try and show that. So we'll go ahead and cut these zip ties, but make sure you don't let these bushing ends fall out and get lost. And then when you go and guide this into place on the front subframe, make sure that the orientation doesn't twist or you lose turn count or anything like that. Alright, so here's the camber rod end in. So the long end of the bushing is going to be pointing towards the front of the car. The short end is to the rear. I just got the bolt and nut in there temporarily to hold it into position. Now this is for the caster side. The long end is up, short end is down, and then we also have the additional spacer that we're going to be putting on top of there. So what I like to do is actually put this on without the little bracket that goes on with it just yet. It's going to go into that frame hole right there. So you're going to be using this long ass bolt and then the spacer on top of that. And then as you're threading this bolt in, you're going to kind of want to adjust the turnbuckle here in and out to extend and shorten this so that everything lines up perfectly as that long ass bolt goes in. You do not want to force the bolt in, strip it, cross thread it, etc. You want to make sure everything is lined up nicely and threads in nicely. So I can't really do it with one hand, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now and then show you guys what it looks like. Alright, so here's what we got so far for the rear caster bushing. Now, this is not going to be the final setup. I kind of just like to get everything into position like this so that you can fine-tune the extension and retraction of this caster rod, and then you can kind of align the bushings and do everything properly there. Once we get the final point installed for the front lower control arm, which will be to this ball joint end, then we'll go back and then we'll take this, jack it up, take the main bolt out, and then we can put in this bracket to hold everything back in for the rear. But I just like to have it like this first so that you can get the alignment and everything down before you start buttoning everything up. So when you took off the castle nut from the OEM one, there should have been a washer. Freaking Marcus, of course, lost his. So I gotta go through my hardware and see if I can find a washer. But this is the part where you use this thick washer as well from Racer X. So what you do is you put this ball joint end over the ball joint stud. There will be the thick washer, the OEM washer, then the castle nut. Then we're going to torque that, put the cotter pin in, and then that end will be done. Alrighty, so here's the ball joint and the castle nut all said and done. So once you get the stud through, you got the thick Racer X washer, the OEM washer, the castle nut, and then you want to torque the castle nut to 30 foot-pounds, and then you're going to want to check the alignment of this hole in the stud with the openings of the castle nut. If it's not perfectly aligned, you want to torque it ever so slightly. Just keep tightening it until you can get it to line up. After you torque it to 30 foot-pounds, then the cotter pin is going to be able to go through like so, come out the other side, and then you will bend these openings to lock the cotter pin in place, and that'll make sure that this castle nut never goes loose over time and your ball joint doesn't fall off your lower control arm. Alrighty, so we got the ball joint torqued down, we got the cotter pin installed and locked like so. Now we can go ahead and actually torque this front subframe bolt to about 60 foot-pounds. Then we're going to jack this rear portion up so that it doesn't fall. We'll be able to install that bracket and then button up the rest of the things like the subframe brace, the sway bar end link, and then you're pretty much done. Then you'll have to tighten up those jam nuts. Alright, so here's what I was talking about having the jack hold the lower control arm out so that you can take that big bolt back out and then attach this bracket. So these two bolts in the rear, the 219s, those are going to be on 110 foot-pounds of torque. The main bolt for the rear bushing right there, that's going to be 103 foot-pounds. And just to reiterate, the ball joint is 30 foot-pounds. Then tighten it until the cotter pin hole can line up. And then the front subframe is going to be 60 foot-pounds. And I believe the sway bar end link is 45 for the fronts. So we turn the camber rod out 8 turns on the turnbuckle. This should be pretty good for us. We won't really know until we take it for a test drive, but the axle geometry looks good. The caster one can be fine-tuned as you need. In case the wheel is too far forward or too far back, you can tweak the caster rod a little bit, but you shouldn't have to mess with the camber rod, so that's good. And then as long as you aren't forcing these rods to adjust in either direction, then you shouldn't have any issues with them binding with each other. And with this wheel assembly pushed out further, that should satisfy the binding of the axle. Just remember that the front lower control arms, they don't really give you more camber. They're more designed to push the hub out, relieve the axle bind, and therefore allow you to run more camber. Remember that most of the camber that you're going to get is going to be from slotting and also the top hats. And that is about it, guys. So make sure you have everything torqued down. I'm going to be putting this in later, but once you have everything torqued down, all you have to do is make sure that you jam these nuts so that these adjustments do not move at all, and then from there you should be good to go. Hopefully I covered everything, but leave a comment below if I missed anything or you have any additional questions.